Ah, good evening, and thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Lisa Neal-Graves, and I am a candidate for Douglas County Commissioner for District 2. I struggled today and for the last couple of weeks, really just trying to figure out what would I say. I know that I need to make a statement. I know that I need to talk about what's happening in our nation right now. But I'll be honest with you, I haven't been able to really sleep. And when I do sleep, I'm always awakened and I have music blaring in my ears because it makes me feel better when I hear music. And the song that comes to mind the entire time that I'm going through the drama or the trauma is really Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes and featuring Teddy Pendergrass. And it's the song "Wake Up Everybody." I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with the words of that song, but I do think it's important that we just take a minute and just talk through them for a second. The words start out with "Wake up, everybody. No more sleeping in bed. No more backwards thinking. It's time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There's so much hatred, war, and poverty." It says, "Wake up, all the teachers. Time to teach a new way. Maybe then they'll listen to what you have to say, because they're the ones who's coming up and the world is in their hands. When you teach the children, you got to teach them the very best you can." I think about that in the context of two things. The first is, I feel like we've been sleepwalking. And we've been sleepwalking primarily because we've accepted for so long the norm is police brutality. We've accepted for so long that while it's not okay, we don't believe that there's much we can do differently about it. What I've witnessed and experienced, and I've seen Tay Anderson out and doing a lot in terms of protest, what I've seen with the younger generation is they're saying no to that. They're saying that's not okay. They are responding in ways that let me know that there really is hope and that the people that are going to bring that forward are young people. When I started this LITcast, I started the LITcast with the expectation that we needed the younger voices at the table for policymaking, that we needed the younger voices to help us make sure that we're being way more inclusive than we've ever been before. I felt like this was an opportunity for us to really leverage hearing from young minds, and most of them are so incredibly brilliant that it's just time for us to listen. And it occurred to me that it's no accident that we had the virus, the pandemic, that really made us stop and think and go into, we had to think about it internally. And for the young people who couldn't hang out with their friends, they not only thought about it internally, they had a chance to watch in the window to social media. And so as we thought through that, the second thing that came to mind was I wanted to talk to my LITcast crew and figure out what could we talk about? Could you help me think through what should we say and how do we say it? And so it's an opportunity to have a no judgment discussion, but an opportunity to hear from some young people who have thought deeply about some of these things. And so I invited the crew, Jordan Porter, who is on the call, and he'll join us shortly. I also invited Kiya Cockrell, who's on the call, and she will join us. And they'll all introduce themselves because I think it's important that you hear from them, their introduction. And then I have, last but not least, of course, Abby Miller. Each of them have linkage to Colorado, but each of them also have sort of experiences that are outside of Colorado or Colorado norms. And I want them to talk to us and share with you their experiences from their lived experiences, really, to give you an opportunity to hear from them. Why is this moment such a big movement for them? So we'll start having everybody come on to the screen. We'll start with Jordan.
Hi, everybody. So my name's Jordan Porter, and I think really for me, with my experience with race, it's hasn't been one that I think a lot of people. I grew up in North Carolina, and I think it hasn't been one that a lot of people outside of the South might necessarily be familiar with. And so for me, growing up in that kind of atmosphere, we're taught about the Confederacy, slavery, racism at a really young age, but I don't think we really ever do it in a way that addresses it critically. So for a really long part of my education and my experiences growing up, racism was something that I thought of as, and I know a lot of my family members thought of as well, as something that where it was just one person who was doing something bad, who was thinking about people in a bad way and couldn't necessarily feel that connection. But really, I think as I've actually tried to look at it and tried to learn about it intentionally, there's so much structuralism to it, which now looking back at how I would define racism today is so I guess inherent in the way that I think about it. But I think for me and for a lot of people who have family that grew up in the South, and I know a lot of people here in Douglas County are from places like Georgia or North Carolina or Florida or Texas, it's not really the way that you might think about it might not be the way that your family thinks about it. And so having those conversations for me is really, really important and something that I haven't really gotten the chance to do. So that's a really long-winded answer of why I'm excited to be here today. But um, yeah, I'm just really happy to engage and share what I can with everyone. And I know that's limited as a white person, but I'm hoping to take the chance to not just share my own experience, but to learn and to educate myself today.
So as we were talking about it, Jordan, you introduced me to Kiya, and
Yeah.
Kiya has agreed to come on the show, and we're excited to welcome her on. So welcome, Kiya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kiya, and I think it's just really important for me to be here today because I think, especially with everything that's going on, people are realizing a way to kind of help, and a lot of that is muting the outside noise and amplifying the voices that need to be heard. And I'm just excited to finally have that voice. I think that coming from a place as diverse as Chicago and then moving to this boarding school in Colorado where I saw no one who looked like me um, kind of really changed my perspective on what is the norm and how you deal with situations because I had never experienced them personally. And if I had experienced them through family members, we were kind of safe to go to each other in numbers versus like isolating myself, moving away from my family and dealing with these situations. So I think just today, like it's so incredibly important for me to share my experience and help others who may feel like their voice would have been muted otherwise if we had not had this global pandemic where people could really take the time to focus on the things that are super important. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then we have Abby, who's been a part of our show before as well. So Abby Miller.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Abby Miller. And I think it's really important for me to be part of this conversation today, just because historically, like, people like me and myself included, like, have not been part of conversations like this. And I think through not actively participating in conversations on race, I and people who look like me have been perpetuating these ideas and these stereotypes of racism unintentionally. And I think a lot of that comes from just the fear of saying the wrong thing and doing something wrong and accidentally being racist. But through not saying anything, we've been perpetuating these racist ideas. So I think it's really important for me to be here today because I think being part of this conversation, I can start to learn and educate myself on what race looks like in my life. Coming from a place like Fort Collins, I see a lot of white people every day, and so it hasn't always been an active part of my life. And what I'm focused on, but I think through this global movement that we're seeing, I'm realizing that it's no longer okay to be silent, and it's no longer okay to be a bystander if we really do want to fight these racist ideas. And so, yeah, I'm just really excited to be here today, not only to bring my experience to the table, but really to listen and to show that people like me, really do need to take the time to engage in conversations on race if we do want to fight racism.
And if I could take the chance to piggyback off of that really quick, I think like the first thing that what Abby had said made me think of is I know a lot of young people especially have probably seen it all over everyone's stories, but that Desmond Tutu quote, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And I think a lot of us have just kind of posted that or seen that without really taking the time to digest and think about what it means. But what Abby just kind of described, I think is exactly the way that we really need to be looking forward at things.
Awesome. So we've had everybody introduce themselves, and the way that the conversation is going to go, and we talked about this sort of as we were prepping, is that what we really want to come out of this is the dialogue to have people know that you can be judgment free. I lived in China for 3 years, and I did not look like the Chinese. In fact, I was about 1.5 feet taller than most. And the way that I had to integrate or at least assimilate was to actually spend time talking, right? And so, I had these opportunities where we called them girls' night out, but we had a variety of different people that we brought together, and we talked about the Chinese culture and how that is perceived by somebody that's an outsider, and particularly somebody that's a Black outsider, because they understood about racism in the US. And I remember saying, we've never had these conversations before. And so maybe this becomes a start of how we have the right kinds of conversations so that people recognize I can share my belief and my fears and my insecurities about it, but not feel like I'm going to be judged or damned for doing so. So we've got these 3 core questions that we're going to just sort of talk through. And what I ask is if people have questions, if you're listening on Facebook and you've got questions, we do have somebody monitoring the chat for Facebook. And so feel free to post a chat, and we'll try to weave in your questions as well. But I also just want to make sure, again, that these are the opinions of young people, and these are their lived experiences, and there's no right or wrong answer to them. It is really just what it is. And let's start with that, and then we can figure out how to frame it into something that it needs to be from here. So let's start with that very first question, right? What's your lived experience with racism and its impact? So we can actually, we can start with you, Kiya.
Okay, I think that something that's kind of surprised me as far as racism as me not knowing how much of a spectrum it is. I think going to boarding school, kind of a predominantly white institution, I would think like they're not intending for it to be bad, or they don't mean harm with it. That means it's not racism. But I was slowly introduced to microaggressions and things that I probably wouldn't have known just growing up in such a diverse place like Chicago. So it took for me to kind of live through those experiences and see people say like, wow, you're so articulate, or you're not what I thought you would be. And I was kind of like, why not? Why is there a specific assumption with what comes with me? And I think that kind of the conversation that we're having right now, to go with what Jordan and Abby were saying, is this idea of neutrality, the fact that I was so unaware of kind of this stance that's like, oh, well, I don't choose to speak on it. It's not really for me. And seeing kind of that impact on how I felt in moments that could have been considered like cognitive dissonance, or like some sort of butting heads with someone, and I was like waiting for my friends to back me up, and when I heard silence, I was like, this hurts more than the person who said it. And I think that's kind of where I realized how much it's not just racism in this kind of idea, like Jordan was saying, where it's just one person being extremely hateful, but it could also be people not standing up for you, or people allowing it sort of to happen, kind of going based off what my old dean had said, what you permit, you promote. And I didn't really see that until I was able to put myself in a situation like that. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And one of the reasons why we wanted to actually have you on was because your experience in living in Chicago and then coming to a place like Fountain, Colorado, very different, very different. How about you, Jordan?
Yeah, I think, like I was saying before, it's kind of the issue of like not even, or as with my background, like it's kind of the issue of not even recognizing what racism necessarily means. And like Kiya was saying, dealing with, or like perpetuating those sorts of microaggressions and statements that you might not be aware of that are actually having an impact on people. And again, I think the biggest thing for me is recognizing, or getting to the point where you're able to recognize the sort of structural or institutionality, that's a way to put it, within racism. And I remember a time in seventh grade, I think, when we were taking this environmental sciences class, and this one girl was doing a project about pig farms in North Carolina, because that's a big industry there, and where they were located geographically in the state and where their dumping sites were located in the state also correlated with communities of color. And so she was talking about this thing called environmental racism. And my immediate reaction to that, being in middle school and not being aware of what racism actually was that it wasn't racism. There wasn't someone intentionally saying, I want to put these by a Black community because I hate Black people. But of course, that isn't what happened, but that isn't what might make this not racist. It is a racist phenomenon because it's perpetuating the inability of Black people to have that advantage, and it's relying on communities of color that aren't necessarily able to have the political voice, especially in a state like North Carolina, to say that they don't want to have these toxic sites so close to their house. And because they're not able to do that, I know this is kind of a lecture on what racism is, but that is how you would define racism. And so being able to see the difference then, looking back at that, I think is just so huge. And I'm not entirely sure if I can say there's a defining moment where I understood, or if there was a defining moment where I could look back at myself and say, you were racist because you were perpetuating racism by not acknowledging it. But I think I still have to contend with the fact that it happened and go forward in a way where I'm vocally trying to act against it.
Nice, well done. How about you, Abby?
Yeah, I think my experience is really, really similar to Jordan's in a lot of respects, as like racism was never really prominent in my life. Like it was a unit that we learned about in school, and like that was about it. Like we learned about MLK and then nobody ever talked about it. And I think that comes from living in a place like I live, where just like representation of people of color just isn't there. And so I think racism has always kind of been veiled by the fact that like no one around me has ever fought against it. So like I've heard racist remarks and I've heard racist jokes said, obviously like not to me but around me, and I guess for the longest time like I was never able to place it because I wasn't able to see the people who it was going to affect. So I was never able to like humanize what racism was because I didn't know the people who were affected by it. And so I think for the longest time, like racism was almost just like this idea that maybe I would someday have to like face or see someone that I knew face eventually down the road, but I was almost in this little protected bubble where like it wasn't going to affect me and it wasn't going to affect those that I knew because the majority of my friends were white. And so I think through like this movement that we're seeing now, like I've really been able to humanize racism and really been able to see like how it does affect people and really place it with individuals rather than just have it be like this out there idea.
You know, it's interesting because each of you talked about the whole notion of learning about racism, and I can't fathom what it means to learn about racism, because if you're learning it, it's kind of, you're learning it from a person that hasn't really experienced racism. Really, are you learning it, right? How do you teach something that is, for all intents and purposes, incredibly difficult to even get your arms around, right? Because there's just so many different variations of it. I just remember it's not quite the same, but it's a little bit of it's sort of an analogy, and it's the Chinese learn English. Everybody learns English when they're in elementary school, but they generally learn English from a non-English speaker. So a lot of what they're saying and how they say things is based on how they learned to speak it. And I remember one of my friends asking me, you know, she said that I loved Sesame candy. And I thought, I don't even know what Sesame is. And I asked her to spell it for me. And what she spelled was sesame. And it's because she had learned English from a non-English speaker. And so all the rules that we learn as kids growing up, you know, the whole I before E, and, you know, when an E is long, when an I is long, all of those things, they didn't quite learn it in the same way that we learned it. They learned it sort of through route. And I think if you learn racism in that way, it becomes very difficult to internalize it, right? And to make it a part of who you are so that you know how to act against it or to act on it. I guess the next question would really be sort of as a flow from that is policy. If you were really able to make policy, you know, what would that look like? And what would be your foundational principle, you know, with that policy?
If I could, just immediately going off of what you said, I think the key to it has to be education, something like what we're doing right now. Like exactly what you had said, learning about racism from a white person who's benefited from it or who hasn't experienced it directly makes, I think, like white kids that are learning about it, or makes it really difficult for white kids that are learning about it to A, understand it, and to B, feel the need to talk about it. So I think there are times as well where it doesn't come up, because especially if you have at least some understanding, and I think a lot of people in our generation do, like just through social media, that it exists and it's kind of out there in a bigger way that they've been shown to it, but they don't really want to talk about it because like they don't know if they're saying sesame or sesame. They don't know what words they're saying wrong, and they're scared of actually having an interaction that reinforces their racism. Or at least speaking from my own experience, I think that's been the case.
Awesome. How about you, Abby?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, like Jordan was saying, like, I think that learning, like, about racism from a white person, like, didn't really get me anywhere in life. Like, I learned about it from all white teachers in an all white classroom and pretty much like an all white town. And so I think that's kind of what led me to not be able to internalize it. And so I think when we're seeing it on social media and so many people are being exposed to it, especially from people of color, like I think that's why this is such a movement now, because we're hearing about it from people who are experiencing it directly and seeing how that's affecting them. And I totally agree. I think that's how we should learn about racism, is through people who have experienced it and who know what it's like to have racism used against them, not used to benefit them.
Yeah. And Kiya, I know that your circumstances are a little bit different, but please, by all means, share.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same idea of education. I think that something that's really important though is kind of this baseline of understanding. I think a huge part of like education in and of itself I know that I can speak when I look at the Black community, it's like, oh, well, we don't want like white people to participate in our conversation. And there's just so much division among how to go about informing people that it seems counterproductive. But I think the most important thing is just keeping those spaces open for uncomfortable conversations, or kind of pushing that idea like, hey, I really don't know what you're going through, but I want to understand, and I will never be in your shoes, but how can I help? And I think that if there was a baseline of having this diversity and kind of growing up and acknowledging these things with that personal connection, it could really change the way people view things. I think education isn't just this academic textbook that's like, okay, here's racism, because I think a huge thing about it is that I remember even learning from textbooks, it's like, oh, racism is over, you know, like slaves are no longer a thing, racism is over. And then as I like grew older, I was starting to see like, oh, it has many different forms. There's institutionalized racism, there's privilege. I wasn't aware of those things before. And those are kind of things you can't really put into a textbook. You have a lot of this from personal experience, whether that's seeing someone around you experience it or you having that personal connection. And I think that just having kind of this like lack of division is what immediately informs people. So I think just kind of that education through those personal connections is what we really need.
And
Yeah,
going
I
off of like hearing Kiya reflect on that as well, I think just my immediate reaction to that was that I think there's so much difficulty in a white person wanting to say that they want to be educated about racism, just for the fact that that places so much burden, so much of a burden on the people of color around them, in expecting another person to constantly um, remind you what you're doing and how you can do better. I think a lot of it really needs to rely on white people actively seeking out ways that they can educate themselves and actively trying to self-reflect on what they've done and how they've contributed to the problem. And even if that causes you shame, that's something that I think we just really have to deal with it. There's no way around it. If you want to address racism as a white person, you have to address your own complicity in creating that.
Yeah, Jordan, you just made me think of something, and I was kind of thinking about this when I was like contemplating this question earlier, but I think we need to be like really equitable, not only through like the education, but through like policy in general. Because like as we're talking about like education on racism, like I don't think we need to educate like Black people as much about like this is what it feels like to have like something racist said to you, because like they've lived that experience. But I think we need to have like more equitable policy where that education does go more to white people who haven't experienced that. And you can go beyond education there with really any type of policy, but just like meeting people where they're at. And so then it's not necessarily equal to begin with, but then we have like a better chance of being equal in the end.
I agree. You guys you're so brilliant. I love that you're thinking so deeply. And you know, to the points that you're both making, and also what you were saying as well, Kiya, is when I started work, and it was many moons ago and long before you guys were born. But when I started work, there were, you know, one of the things that was realized by large corporations at that point was that you really can't manage hearts and minds, right? You can't really manage people in terms of how they think and how they feel, but what you can do is manage behaviors. And I remember that there was a program that the AT&T Bell Labs actually did for some of their senior managers. They called it like an urban development program. And they would take the senior leaders in Colorado, they would take them to the 5 Points, which is kind of funny, right? Because the 5 Points probably for all intents and purposes was not even near what one would consider a bad area, right? But they would take them to the 5 Points area and tell them that they had to figure out how to get back home. And it was all white. These were all white males, and they would be in downtown Denver in the core of where presumably Black people lived. And at that time, I think it was probably more half and half. It wasn't even quite all Black. But it's quite interesting that that program gave them an opportunity to feel what it's like to be the only one in the room, where many, you know, Kiya, I know that you were like the only one in the room in many of your classes, right? What we learned from those experiences is that, and one of the folks that went through it, and I had asked them about it, I asked the question, so what did you learn and how did it make you feel? What we learned from that experience really was that what this gentleman said to me was, I knew I could come back home and that home would actually be okay, right? I knew that this was not a long-term decision for me. It was not, I was gonna have to live there forever. And so I think about the fact that, you know, Kiya, you moved from Chicago to Fountain, Colorado. And while, you know, it's one thing to say, I can handle this for a couple of weeks, it's a whole nother thing to say that you can handle it for 4 years. You know, I guess that sort of leads us to, you know, this final question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But that final question is really the work that you guys are doing in terms of how you're thinking about it now. What is it that we can do to support your efforts to make sure that we're creating really a much better and more just society? You know, as you guys call us, probably not directly, but I know how you feel, right? The olds actually have a different perspective about this than you do. And you really do have an opportunity because you're at the very beginning of what life is going to offer for you. And you get to decide, you get to build as opposed to try to correct. What can we do to support the build out so that you're building exactly what you want? You're always going to make mistakes. Everybody does. But how do we just give you the support that you need to make sure that as you're building, you're at least building with good intentions?
I think one thing that I kind of think about is the tolerance aspect. I think right now we're all kind of realizing that there are no there is no middle ground between this oppressive force and the oppressed, which honestly, I'm really happy that people are now having this realization, but I think there's a common misconception of what is considered disrespectful and not hearing another person's point of view before, like, instead of simply informing someone like, hey, this is how you respect another human being. I think going to the high school that I did, there was always some sort of like pushback on me trying to reach out on if I felt uncomfortable. It's like, oh, well, you should think about how this person is feeling, or you should think this is how they grew up, like this is different. There were always like, well, will you forgive them? It was more pushed towards, hey, you should respect their point of view. And I get that idea, but I'm saying that certain things to me feels like it shouldn't be controversial. Like I shouldn't feel like my view of respecting everyone as a human should be this, oh, agree to disagree. And I think that school just in general, because we have like these different people, of course they can't outwardly say like, oh, I'm specific on these policies, this, you know, side, left or right. But at the same time, I feel like there's so much tolerance of what is promoting bigotry in some ways and saying like, oh, well, you should look into the other person's point of view. What about not respecting people? What about how they grew up? And it's kind of like I found myself like being frustrated because I'm like, I get that I shouldn't be a person who's saying I'm right, they're wrong, because truly in everybody's mind, that's what they're thinking. But at the same time, I was like, if I'm thinking that everyone should be treated with respect, then how how am I wrong? Like I wanted to know that. And I think that something that's so important is like learning the tolerance. Like there are just some situations that you cannot stand neutral in. And I think one really quick thing that I'm kind of gonna go off on a tangent is I remember my brother studying psychology, and he would have to learn all these effects and terms, right? And he talked about the bystander effect, which is, you know, if someone's getting hurt and then there's one person who's there, they're going to immediately help them. But if there's this crowd of people, then everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it, and it prevents like everyone from actually stepping up and dealing with that problem. And I feel like that's kind of been the situation I felt in a high school, because it's like everyone is expecting someone to do something, and I'm going to, you know, the head of school, I'm having these meetings with teachers, and they're just like, oh, that sounds really hard. Have you tried talking to this person? Have you tried talking to the counselor? And I'm like, I'm not getting anywhere. I'm like chasing my tail basically. And I think that it comes from this idea of like, oh, well, let's all be respectful. And I think there's a difference between being respectful and knowing when you have to have tough conversations, instead of just allowing kind of this idea that it's okay to disrespect someone over something that they can't control, whether that's race, sexuality, age, socioeconomic status, and gender. There's so many things that, you know, we are kind of born into that we cannot control, that determine if somebody's life is going to be better than someone else's. Things that we can't control, certain privileges that we have or don't have. And I think it's constant, like it's very important to constantly kind of inform that, because if you allow people to believe in the idea that, you know, everyone has equal opportunity, then it's a lot harder for someone to see kind of into the shoes of someone else when they know they will never have that person's exact experience. So that was a long answer, but I was just saying, you know, tolerance, like that should be something that's kind of taught.
Got it.
Yeah. I think coming from the same school as Kaya as well, and I know a lot of like public schools put a big pressure on this, but it's like the idea of tolerance as a school's ideology, like accepting everything, becomes really, really difficult when you have to tolerate the intolerant. And I think just because I haven't felt the same things that Kaya necessarily has, I haven't experienced them in the same way, but going to the same school, I think I've seen them, but from a different perspective. And for me, it just becomes a little bit more difficult to do that, because I know that I have family members who I have a, you know, like an ethical duty, I guess, to love or to connect with, because they're my family. That sounds really bad. I'm sorry.
I guess I have to
But
love.
It's
I
real.
guess I have to love them. But at the same time, you still have to contend with the fact that, yeah, one of my grandmas has a problem with biracial couples, and dealing and tolerating that intolerance and going beyond that to accepting someone as part of your family where you're legitimizing intolerance, I think becomes really, really difficult, because you almost have to have this this code switch between ignoring something and being racist because you're upholding a racist system, and then turning around from your family and saying, um, I'm not I'm going to be anti-racist. I'm going to call other people out when I don't have to respect them. And so I think the difficulty for me is merging those and finding a way where I can be anti-racist with my family and still accept my family, because that is a really huge dichotomy, and I just don't know how to contend with that.
Wow, that's nice. I mean, it's so poignant and so spot on, right? It's that razor thin line. On one side, you got to love them because they're your family. On the other side, hate their values, hate what they think and how they think.
Yeah.
But thanks for sharing that, because honestly, I think that that's part of, this is part of the dialogue, right? How about you, Abby?
Yeah, oh my gosh, I totally agree with what both of them said, but I think they both kind of touched on this lightly, and I know there's a lot of talk about this right now, but I think like if you want to like support the efforts to like create a better and more just society, like if you're looking to do that, then like have those tough conversations and like live in the uncomfortableness of it, because if we really are going to move forward, like I think it starts like within you and within like the people that you know in your circles. And so I think just having those conversations, like regardless of who you are, and really almost like joining the fight will really help efforts to like move us along and create that like better and more just society eventually. But yeah, I completely agree with what everyone's saying.
Nice. So Alana Spiegel, who is also running for C Regent for District 6, is awesome. Who is awesome is, by the way, her statement was, those systems of go talk to that person are by design and often don't work for Black students and educators or allow conversations about race to happen. And that really needs to change. So that aligns specifically with what you guys are saying. So thanks, Alana. One other question that came through was, the question was asked, do I think racism is better or worse? And I'll have to, to be honest, 100%. I think that up until a couple of months ago, we all were, at least I was, living sort of this space that said, it's hard, but it is what it is, and I just have to figure out ways around it and how to work through it. In the last couple of months, I see that it's not something that we can work through. It's not something that I specifically can change, and we have to just by default do better. And the thing that bothers me and what makes me hurt and angry, and at the same time recognizing that I have to figure out ways to be part of the solution, is that we live in a county where, Douglas County is a county where Black people make up 1.4% of the population. And I am often reminded of, I had to go to church when I was a kid. If the church was open, I was there. And one of the things that you learned, there's a parable that talks about a shepherd who had these 100 sheep, and one of the sheep got away, and he left the 99 to go find the one. And I think about that, and I ask the question, where is the voice of our Board of County Commissioners for the 1.4% of the population that they are responsible for as well? And they have been remarkably silent. And they have, in my opinion, been more than just complicit. They've actually encouraged by saying, there was the question about opening up the county, and there's the issue that was raised was, well, let those who are having issues that are like a compromised immune system, let them stay at home, let the rest of us go out. Who says that in leadership, right? How do you define that as true leadership? So I worried about that in the context of, do I say something to denounce them? And then, I think about when you see things that are really racist that's happening, if you're not right there in the moment, I almost feel like how with dogs, you have to discipline them when they do it, because if you do it after the fact, they think you're crazy because they don't know what it's tied to, right? I feel like that's racism, and that's what we've done with racism, is that we don't call people out on it in the moment. We call them out on it when they do it for the 10th time and that we've had it up to here. That's not the place where I want us to be. So in answering the question, is racism better or worse? I would honestly answer it's worse, because we've allowed it to just deteriorate the whole, the idea that a Black person is equal to a white person. We've allowed that to go so far as for folks to really not even see Black people as human, right? We've allowed the dehumanization of Black people in a way that makes it really difficult to come from behind to figure out how do we make this go forward. So for me, the only way that I saw that was truly a forward moving direction was to start with the youth. Start with you guys, because you don't really have baggage, right? You have an opportunity to really do what many folks might be afraid to do, because it means sacrificing something that they've actually been benefiting from as a privilege for a long time. And to call people on racism means to let that go. And, you know, if you've lived with it for so long, you don't even know if you can live without it. You know, I can't say that I don't have privilege, right? I live in a place where, you know, obviously we have the ability to afford things, but I still get, you know, if I go someplace and I can be the leader of the team, I still get, you know, are you the admin, right? I still get, you know, and I always, you know, initially when I was younger, I would be so angry about it, right? But now I'm never really angry about it. I laugh about it. And then I find a moment where they can actually feel what it should feel like to be embarrassed by making the bad assumption that they made. You know, and so all of that to say, we have an opportunity here to do the right thing, right? We have an opportunity to be better than what we were. My hope is that in having these conversations, like you're having a conversation that's a facilitated conversation, my prayer is that you go back and have these kinds of conversations openly with your friends, even with friends that, for all intents and purposes, don't look like me, don't look like, you know, a Latinx person, but even your white friends need to have this dialogue. They need to understand these issues. And if they hear it from you, it'll be much different. I want to close out, because we're getting towards the end of our hour. And I want to close this out by asking, you know, one of the things that Jordan bragged about you, Kiya, and he said that your poetry was amazing, and that some of it brought tears to his eyes. And so I want to just ask if you would honor us and share some of your poetry as we leave.
For sure, for sure. It's honestly pretty crazy the fact that like I have poems from 2 or 3 years ago that are still relevant to what I was talking about, and it's just like, wow, it's another person. But I think I'm gonna share this one that I actually finished today. And I think the reason that I'm choosing that is because a lot of my poems dig into like what I feel will happen in the future. Kind of the two that I was choosing between, the one that I'm not going to do is called Black Horror Stories. And I was kind of talking about like how I would have to raise my sons, my Black sons, and how I would tell them to act differently when I grow up. But the poem that I'm about to read is coming specifically from my experience as a Black woman. So I think that's why I'm choosing to do this one. I'm trying to stay humble to my experience, but it doesn't have a title. Underneath, we are the same skeleton, and the only difference is I am dipped in heavenly melanin. I am not insecure, nor am I ashamed of the braids I wish to be straightened in every special occasion from before, when white beauty was considered the only right beauty, before Instagram influencers paid to look like me. I was seeking validation from others who looked nothing like me but wanted to. Plump lips used to script words of wisdoms and fall onto your ears. My voice is the very coping mechanism that brings definition to soul, to love. I am a Black woman. I've never known ugly. I am the nourishment that encourages the progression and collection of communities to form unity. I am the very person you've attempted to replicate at some point with plastic surgery, forming your tongue to slur words used to be defense of your murder of me. The acrylic nails and hoops and excessive lip gloss, the protective styles that become trendy. This isn't what offends me. I am offended by the very denial that my life matters. Just as much as the love for my culture is shown, I want you to love me. without exchange or payment of my blackness. I'm fresh out of inward passes to give you. I've watched you beat me down just to constantly get up and forgive you. Black women are the very religion and goddesses that you should give into. We will save you. We will pave ways for you. And if you kill us, I'd be afraid for you, because no one will fight for you like we do. We perform miracles simply because we need to. And we need to, but we put aside that pain that we feel, struggling ourselves because we want everyone else to heal, juggling the internal battle of what is beauty when Black women are seen as sassy, moody, and rudely demanding, when in reality we're simply outstanding. And when we are gone, you'll be alone, outstanding, and no one will be with you, and you'll understand our gift to make love out of hate, to show pride in our race, and to be alive amongst the hate. Thank you.
That is amazing. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Abby, Kiya, Jordan, you guys are brilliant human beings, and I am grateful knowing that you exist and that you are bringing up what will be the new generation and a world that I pray is more just and more accepting, and to your words, Kiya, more tolerant. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Take
Thank
care and have a
you.
good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Bye.